So we talked about space. I want us to talk about energy now, and particularly the plans for net zero. India making huge strides in its adoption of renewable, but there is still a lot to do, particularly around things like AI-driven grids, adopting the right digital infrastructure, ensuring that supply of critical minerals too. So how do we overcome those challenges? What can India and the UK learn from each other to make sure they can tackle those shared energy challenges? So please welcome my panel, who are very neatly arranged on this, so come on up. Olivia Powis, Chief Executive of Carbon Capture and Storage Association. Prue Ashby, Head of Sustainability at London and Partners. Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who's the Chief Executive of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Ruth Herbert, last but not least, Managing Director, Business Development and Strategic Initiatives at Essar Energy Transition. Welcome to you all. Really nice to see you on this. And we've got sort of 20 minutes or so to bash through this. And maybe, Olivia, let me start with you. Talk to me about the collaboration that's going on right now, because quite clearly this is a global problem. And we always talk about that collaboration needs to be done across borders. Is that happening, in particular with a focus on UK and India?
Yes, I mean, I think, yes, it is, and we'll hear from Ruth in a bit, who's working on a particular project. But I think in terms of how we're going about, you said it's a global market, so I work in Carbon Capture and Storage Association. We've got 120 members who are also globally represented members, and we're about the commercial deployment of carbon capture and storage. And so really, in terms of how the UK's developed, and we've developed the regulatory and legislative framework to enable the industry to develop, and there's been an awful lot of work that's gone into that from the government and industry over the past 4 years to develop that and really put in place everything that needs to be there to develop a whole new industry, not entirely from scratch. This isn't a new technology, but to develop it at this scale and to deal with the industrial decarbonisation that we need to get to and meet our net zero targets. So it's been really critical that as we've worked through that and developed the business models, the legislative framework, the roadmap for investors to understand the opportunities as we go through that we are engaging and really working across borders to work to establish partnerships, but also to make sure that we're sharing that learning, and what we've done and developed in the UK is being shared across, but also then in terms of technology development, how are we moving forward? That it's the same technology that will be deployed on a gas plant here for carbon capture or elsewhere, or energy from waste plant or industrial plant. And so how can we look at evolving that technology, and how can we make sure that we've got the opportunities to discuss that globally?
And Ruth, I mean, what does this look like in practice? Talk to me about some of those projects.
So, I mean, first of all, to say that Essar Energy Transition, it represents kind of all of Essar's activities in sort of UK and in Europe, and we're most of that activity is all focused around our refinery, the Stanlow refinery in the northwest of England, which is at the heart of the HyNet cluster. So it's one of the government's first industrial decarbonisation clusters. We're planning to build low carbon hydrogen, as well as so CCS-enabled low-carbon hydrogen, large-scale, probably the UK's first large-scale project, and part of the Track 1 process in the government's competition. And then we've also got carbon capture on our catalytic cracker. So together, the fuel switching, some electrification, and the carbon capture will give us a decarbonised refining process. And I think we're ahead of anywhere in the world. We're going to be the world's first decarbonised refining process. So that's really exciting, and it really demonstrates how traditional foundational industries can play a really key role in the transition. They shouldn't be kind of deterred from being part of the transition. They should embrace it, and they can actually be catalysts for that. And not only does that decarbonise our asset, but that network that will be built, the hydrogen funding that was announced for a hydrogen network in the spending review, that will enable other industries in the northwest to decarbonise. And we're also looking at sustainable aviation fuels. So we've got a big agenda here in the UK. What's really interesting, and why are we doing it in the UK first, right? Because Essar has got lots of assets, US, India, obviously. the UK has sort of strode ahead in terms of its regulatory framework and its policy framework for decarbonisation. So as Olivia was saying, carbon pricing and revenue support for projects, that enables us to make these projects bankable, to get them to final investment decisions. So that's really key, because obviously decarbonising things does cost more initially, but in the long term, we will have a higher quality product. What I would say is complemented by working very closely with our colleagues in India. They're also looking at things like sustainable aviation fuels, and some elements of that are cheaper and easier to do in India due to feedstock availability, or lower energy prices, much more land for renewables and things like that. So it's a really good opportunity to collaborate between UK and India and trade in these new low carbon products. And in India, our colleagues, there's a bit more innovation about, well, how do we make this commercially viable? We've got to make this work commercially. And I find that really stimulating. And that's something the UK government also wants the industry in the UK to embrace, and to not be sort of desiring of subsidy forever. So I think these are really areas where I'm finding we're collaborating really well.
And I want to come on to the value of the kind of public-private partnerships as well, and the role that they play in just a second. But Arunabha, let me bring you in here too about, I posed that question in the introduction about what the UK can learn from India and India learn from the UK. Give me your sense there of who's doing what best, and maybe what the best practice looks like between the two countries.
Well, first of all, I think the primary lesson that India needs to learn from the UK is legislation. Yeah. Getting a climate legislation that backs up the very bold policies that we put forward would be tremendous. It will send that signal to the market. What I think the UK can learn from India is actually designing competitive markets for various different elements of vectors of the energy transition. That includes, of course, how we've driven down through reverse auctions the price of renewables down to about 2.5 US cents. But it also includes many other things that we're doing. So auctions for hybrid projects, solar and wind, or solar plus storage. Designing new markets for large-scale solar irrigation. It's the world's largest program in solar irrigation. The huge push towards distributed energy, 10 million homes to get distributed energy. That alone is about 25 to 30 gigawatts of capacity. I think the point is that the energy transition is not just a switch from coal to renewables. It's actually igniting, pun intended, many new forms of energy and energy markets. So I think this combination of market design in India and legislative design in the UK, I think are ways we could be shaking hands.
Prue, there's a danger in all of this that we talk about this kind of top level, big picture stuff that we all might feel individually unable to contribute to. You've been looking at sort of city level, more local level applications. Just talk to me about what difference they are making and where we might all be involved in this transition.
Yes, so I work for London and Partners with a growth agency for London. And we're very much driven by the mayor and his policies. And he set a target of 2030 for net zero carbon a number of years ago. And that is driving innovation and behaviour change in the city. He recommitted this target in the recent London growth plan that was launched, which is to turbocharge the economy in the next 10 years. And so what we're seeing is sort of three things about London that makes it really exciting. Is firstly the convergence of multiple different sectors. So you've got climate tech and those solutions developing, but you've also got AI, you've got design and creative, you've got financial services and fintech, and the talent associated with those sectors coming together in London. Secondly, you've got investment. And actually, the VC investment, 1.7 billion invested in climate tech in 2024, is a really great number. But also at London Tech Week last week, it was announced 1.44 trillion was invested in tech across the whole of the UK, of which 59% of that is London. So we're seeing a lot of investment in these technology solutions so that we can grow them. Also, green finance is a key area, and actually UK and India are working together a lot on green finance models and mobilizing that finance. And then the third area really is the ecosystem itself, and how we can bring the right people together so clients and technology companies can find the customers that they want, and how they can globalize and how companies can come here and how they can be supported. Checking there's the right incubators and test beds and so on. And I'll just close with a sort of couple of really key examples. We've been working with an Indian company called Off Grid Energy, and they have a zinc a battery sort of chemistry solution for storage of solar and wind power. They've been partnering with Shell and Tata Power in India, and they wanted to expand into the UK. And we've been working closely with them as they expand, making the right connections for them, and they set up their facilities over here. So that's a really exciting example of an Indian company expanding over here. And then in the reverse, we've taken a couple of trade missions from London to India in the last couple of years. In fact, in December, we took an enterprise tech, so AI and sustainability trade mission to Mumbai and Bangalore. And a company that went on that is called Electric Miles. So they're a London company. And what they do is they help with EV charging so that it kind of evens out the peaks and troughs of charging requirements. So helps with leveling out the grid requirements. So they are looking at opportunities in India to expand over there. So this overall policy that's been set has driven innovation and behaviour change here. It's driving innovation from other countries, including India, into London, and also helping London companies go overseas as well.
Olivia, I think we're probably all relatively united on the need to transition to net zero. What are still the hurdles and what are still the challenges? And I'm thinking particularly around policy, but also technology. What's still holding us back?
I think doing this at scale is the challenge. So decarbonising our industries, we know how to do it. We know what needs to be done, and the UK has been spending time putting the business models together to make sure it's about taking away the cross-chain risks. So ensuring that there is somewhere to store the CO2 once it's captured, and vice versa. So really moving forward with those first projects, and then bringing in the investor community, bringing in insurers, as Ruth said, so that we can start really moving forward in terms of enabling these to be self-sustaining industries. But of course, then to do that, we've got to create the markets for those. So we're at this point of transitioning, but then we need to create markets for low carbon products. We need to ensure that, and governments need to work together to ensure that they're providing the framework for that, and whether that's mandates, whether that's incentives, creating that to ensure that we're then driving those markets in the initial stages while they can get going. And the same for carbon markets and removal markets and removal credits. We've seen in the voluntary market there are companies that are really driving this forward in a voluntary basis because they've committed to net zero by 2030. But as we move forward and do this at the scale at which we need to do it to get to net zero by 2050, we need to be expanding that market. And so I think it's now we're working on these first projects. We're really getting underway, and that's happening in the UK particularly, but globally we're seeing the market develop. But moving towards this transition, so providing that map for industries to decarbonise and see their future, but also the markets which are going to drive those future products is really key, and that needs to be done on a global scale. So that's we can't do that just the UK or just India or just the EU. We've got to work together to be able to really move those markets forward.
And quickly, are you confident that's happening?
I think it is happening now. Yes, it is, and there have been, there are some agreements that are now being formed. It's not happening fast enough, and I think it needs to happen on a more global scale. So the more that we can work together and build those partnerships, I think the more chance there is of that happening. But it does need to go faster to be able to give those signals.
And thank you. And Ruth, that brings me to my question about public-private partnerships. Has the conversation changed? Are you seeing that conversation change around not only the need to do it, but it sounds obvious, doesn't it, but the need to work together to tackle this?
Yeah, we've certainly seen that's been necessary in trying to get these first projects, to construction. The process has been bilateral and collaborative for a lot of the time. So government and industry working together to try to find solutions to who should bear what risk and how do we get the investor community comfortable with projects, very new technologies in some cases, in other cases old technologies, but in a totally different application, different scale, for example. So yeah, that is happening, and I mean, for me, it was really summed up, thinking about the first country actually to put in place large-scale CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, Norway, who have got Northern Lights facility, and I was privileged to visit there last year, and the DG of the government there said, we couldn't have done this without working collaboratively with the industry, with the local people, across government, all different parts of government, national, regional, and so forth. So, I mean, I think it really is, and across borders, because ultimately some of these facilities are going to serve multiple countries, and some of the SAF produced in India will need to come to Europe, and some of the, we need to be working to develop these global markets, as Olivia says, because that is what will be needed. But certainly I can see key corridors emerging. There are key markets like UK and India that are quite well suited to each other for some of these low carbon products, where you can do one element of it, say in India, and another element of it in the UK, and that can serve Europe. So, I think there's some really useful collaborations there, and I think if governments embrace those and working proactively with the private sector, we can secure that. And I think one of the key things I've seen is standards, development of common standards is a real enabler. That and public procurement, so where government is buying stuff, government can use that power and that position, especially with a large country like India, to sort of set standards as well that can really sort of accelerate.
I mean, and Arunabha, that plays to your point about common regulation and common standards. Again, are you confident that we are creeping closer to that stage?
Well, I think as with everything, the glass is half full, half empty. I think what we've done is we've grabbed the low-hanging fruit. A lot of the vanilla deployment has happened. A lot of the tech development for the next generation technologies has happened. What we need to now focus on a lot more is, in addition to the partnerships and the policy harmonization and standards harmonization, is actually to think about supply chains in a very strategic manner. We are now talking about the energy transition as a driver of a new industrial era. And if we don't think about supply chains in a way that we're not trying to build protectionist sort of islands in our respective economies, but seeing exactly what components would India have more comparative advantage in, where would the UK have comparative advantage in, who else could be part of this link, where do the critical minerals come in, where do they get refined, where do they get recycled? I think if you line up a range of different policy measures that India has put forward, a taxonomy on green steel, the first in the world, the second largest green hydrogen mission in the world, a critical minerals mission, a huge target for renewables. You add it all up, as well as an emerging taxonomy on climate finance, you begin to see the policy architecture that could then, we were talking about space in the previous panel, dock into whatever is coming up in the UK as well.
But the reason I ask, I mean, when you talk about rare minerals or critical minerals, the exact opposite has happened. What's happening with China, with the United States? What hope is there that supply chain will not be dominated by one or two key players, either in extraction or refining?
So I think the focus has to be a lot more on the refining rather than on the extraction, and on the circular economy of minerals.
Okay.
Rather than everyone looking at where else can I go and compete with the next person to buy up the next mine. What is happening globally is that the pendulum is swinging wildly onto the other side. There is, of course, worry about hyper-concentration on one end, but then everyone thinks that they can do it on their own. That's not going to work. I mean, we're sitting in the Science Museum, go to wherever the physics gallery is, you'll see eventually the swinging pendulum will come to a more stable equilibrium.
Yeah.
What we need to do using policy is to enable that more stable equilibrium.
And Prue, a final thought from you, if you will, in terms of, you talked there about the collaboration between cities, and there's a danger that once again, we look at this as a very localized problem, even though we know that this issue is hugely cross-border. where in the world is doing this well? And, and let me flip the question, what will London learn from other countries?
Yeah, I mean, there's a group called C40, which is a group of cities, almost 100, I think, cities that actually collaborate on city problems and challenges. And the co-chair is actually the Mayor of London at the moment. But they look at like what cities are doing and doing things well. And I mean, you touched on Norway. It was Norway earlier. I mean, the Nordic countries, cities like Copenhagen, and I was recently in Norway, actually in Trondheim and Oslo, and they've, because of their climate extremes, they've had to adapt over a long time, whether it's their buildings and being built in the best way. I mean, 75% of people in Norway drive electric vehicles, 75%. That's a huge proportion of the population. And so they have the infrastructure that goes along with that. So they've had to adapt, and I think those cities are ones where we could learn a lot. But then, Indian cities as well have things that they're doing really well. I went to Bangalore a few years ago, and the way you bring all your tech together in these big campuses and work together and collaborate really effectively in large numbers is really, really good to solve problems as well. So and then London, as I say, I think we are a good example of doing certain things well, especially things like our ultra low emission zone. And then just to finish on, we got London Climate Action Week next week. Maybe some of you in the room are going. There's nearly 900 events, and I think that's a great example of bringing people together to solve problems over intellectual events and networking and things like that.
Wonderful. Our time is up. Thank you. As always, and I always say this, go and find our lovely panellists if you want to talk some more about some of the things that they've raised. But Olivia, to Prue, to Arunabha, and to Ruth, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.